today we're in 6.1, comparing and ordering integers. In a lot of ways, this section is very foundational to the whole chapter, what we're going to be learning. There are some concepts that we're learning today that you really need to understand in order to be successful in the rest of the sections. All right, so in example 1, it's one of those foundational concepts. We need to understand, first of all, what an integer is, and second of all, how they relate to each other on a number line. So let's first talk about what an integer is. An integer is a whole number. Now, it can be a positive number or it could be a negative number, but it's a whole number. So is a fraction an integer? No. And decimal's not an integer. A percentage isn't an integer. And an integer is a whole number. All right, so that's important. That'll also help you on one of your homework questions. Another thing that you need to understand is how positive and negative integers relate to 0. All right, so let's think about 0 here. Let's imagine here that we have a number line that extends all the way across the front of the classroom. And 0 is right in the middle. So what is the next number into the, what are all the numbers to the left of 0? Are they positive or negative?
Negative.
They're negative. So what would be the next number after 0? Negative 1. What about the next number? Negative 2. Then the next number? Negative 3. So what's happening with these negative numbers the farther they get from 0?
Negatively growing.
Okay, they're getting larger, like in number. I go negative 1, 2, 3, but they're getting
Negative.
smaller in value. So is negative 100 bigger than or smaller than negative 50?
That's smaller than.
It's smaller than, because the farther it gets from 0, the smaller the value. You need to understand that, and while it might be easy to explain that now, when you start working these problems, a lot of times I have students start to get confused about that. So you have to understand the smaller or the larger the negative, the smaller the value. Now the opposite is true on the other side of 0. Because on the other side of 0, what kind of numbers do I have? The positive numbers. And I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up. Is 100 bigger than or smaller than 50?
It's bigger than.
It's larger, okay? It's greater than. So the larger the positive number, the greater the value. Okay, so one very important concept that you have to understand is how integers relate to 0. Does that make sense? 0 is our benchmark. 0 is our starting point. It's always our starting point. All right, so now let's look at some integers, and we're going to look at what the opposite would be. We have negative 8, 12, and negative 15. Well, when we're talking about the opposite of these integers, we're talking about how many units it is away from 0. Okay, so for negative 8, how many units is it away from 0? 8. So if it's negative 8 on one side, I go the same number of units on the other side, and it would be positive 8, just 8. Okay, I don't have to write a positive sign.
What is the positive sign?
Okay, I don't have to write a positive sign. Just writing it without a sign, I know that it's positive. Now, in the same respect, if it's negative, you have to make sure you write a negative sign, otherwise you'll get it wrong. So the opposite of positive 12 is negative 12. Same number of units away from 0 on the other side. So it'd be negative 12. The opposite of negative 15 would be 15. All right, I want you to turn in your books to page 253. I'm sorry, 251. Page 251, I want you to do numbers 1 through 4. Numbers 1 through 4 on 251. Okay, so for number 1, what's the opposite of, oh, we already did that. What's the opposite of 15?
Negative 15.
Negative 15. What's the opposite of negative 8?
8.
Just 8. What's the opposite of negative 35?
35.
Just 35. And what's the opposite of 100? Negative 100. Now, again, it's important that you understand that we're talking in terms of how many units it is away from 0 on both sides of the 0. That'll help you understand absolute value, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, the last part of example 1, you're going to have a few homework problems like this. It's talking about positive and negative numbers in the real world situations. So if I were to tell you that I ran 10 miles, okay, Would I represent that with a positive 10 or a negative 10?
Positive.
It would be a positive 10 because I gained 10 miles. I ran 10 miles. So that would just be 10. What if I told you that I spent $100? Would that be a positive 100 or a negative 100? That'd be negative because I had $100 and I spent it, so I lost it. That would be a negative $100 or a negative 100. What if I said that that the football player had a 5-yard loss? A 5-yard loss. Would that be positive or negative 5? That would be negative 5. All right, so real world examples. All right, now I want you to give me a real world example of negative 8 and a real world example of 50. Okay, and it can be anything. All right, it can be anything, but it has to clearly represent a negative 8 and a positive 50. All right, so what did some of you write for negative 8, Zach?
I fell negative 8 feet.
Okay, so I fell 8 feet. You don't have to say negative 8 because when you say fell, I know that it's negative. So I fell 8 feet. All right, Darius? Sure. Well, just do negative 8 for now. Okay, he withdrew $8 from his bank account. All right. So any of these, I fell 8 feet. You lost 10. It lost $8. Whatever. Okay. So as long as it's something that indicates negative. What about 50? What about 50? Somebody different. MJ, what'd you write for 50? Yeah. So it just needs to represent a positive 50. Positive 50. What'd you write, Jackson? Okay, swam 50 feet, so that's a positive, that's a gain. Climbed 50 feet, because went up. Hit the ball 50 feet. Darius? $50, made $50. Okay, Zach?
I skipped 50 miles.
You what?
I skipped 50 miles.
Oh, skipped 50 miles. All right, well, that's interesting. Okay, so real world examples that represent integers. Now, in example 2, I'm comparing integers. Now, sometimes I compare integers using a number line, and sometimes I can just compare them just having 0 in mind and comparing them using more or less mental math. All right, so what if I wanted to compare negative 2 and negative 5? All right, and it says, the instructions say to compare them using a number line. All right, well, what I need to have is I need to figure out, I need to have both of these integers on my number line. So I'll start at negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, and negative 1. And then basically I'm just plotting these points on the values. All right, now where's 0? I don't have 0 on my number line. Where's my 0? It's to the right of negative 1, okay? Now 0 doesn't always have to be on your number line, but here's what you have to make sure, and I see this mistake every year. You have to make sure that the numbers on your number line are trending in the right way, how they relate to 0. Well, if 0 is to the right of negative 1, then all these numbers, the farther left I go, they should be larger, right? We just talked about that at the beginning of the lesson. The farther I get from 0, the larger my negative. So make sure that your numbers are trending in the right direction. Because if you do it opposite, you're going to lose all the points, okay? So make sure your number lines are going in the right direction. And then that's basically how it would do that. Now, is negative 2 greater than or smaller than or less than negative 5? It's greater than. It's closer to 0. And that's the purpose of the number line, to help you see visually, to help you see which number is greater. All right, now, we're not going to use number lines for long, but you are going to see a few of these on your homework tonight. You will see, more commonly, you're going to see some like numbers 5 through 8. So I want you to go ahead and compare these numbers. So write out the 0 and the blank and the negative 7 and tell me, is it greater than or less than negative 7? Go ahead and do numbers 5 through 8. Your turn now on page 252. So number 5, did you say greater than or less than? That was so weak. Greater than or less than? It's greater than. 0 is greater than any negative number. All right, what about number 6, negative 9 and 4? It's less than. Any negative number will be less than a positive number. What about negative 5 and negative 4? It is less than. I mean, it's barely, but negative 5 is still farther away from 0. It's less than. What about negative 3 and negative 13? It's greater than. Who got all those right? Anybody get all those right? Good job. All right, now in example 3, we're ordering integers using a number line. So it gives us integers in terms of degrees. I don't know if you have any just like this on your homework, but you might see just ordering. Actually, you will on your homework tonight. It won't be degrees, but it will be just integers. So what if we had these integers? All right, we had negative 6 degrees Celsius, negative 14, negative 15, negative 12, negative 3, and 6. And it says graph these on a number line. Graph these on a number line. Well, the first thing I need to do is I have to figure out my parameters, what's going to be my lowest number on my number line and my highest number. So what is the lowest or the least amount in my data? Not 15. Negative 15 degrees. Do you agree? Is there any number smaller than negative 15? No. What's the largest number? 6. So I go from negative 15 to positive 6. Do you think I'm going to go by 1s? No. Do you think I'm going to go by 2s? Maybe. You could go by 2s or you could go by 3s. 2s or 3s. I wouldn't go by anything bigger. So if I go by 3s, I want to start with just below the negative 15. So if I'm going by 3s, I'll start with a negative 18, negative 15, and then I keep going. I'm just increasing by 3. All right? So I want you to go ahead and set up your number line and plot the points on your number line. All right, now for the numbers that are not exactly on the point, you see how, for negative 14, there's no number on the number line for negative 14. On those, when there's not a number on the number line, I do want you to go ahead and write it above, just so I know that's the point for negative 14 degrees. Now the rest of them, I labeled them above, but I'm not necessarily going to count off for you if it is a number that's already on your number line. Does that make sense? Now, for negative 14, there's no number, so I do want you to label that one. All right, does yours look kind of like that? Yes. All right, so that's how I would basically order them on a number line. And again, I'm using a number line so that I can clearly see, okay, well, 6 is the largest, and negative 15 is the smallest degree, or the lowest degree. So you're just using number lines to compare integers. Now, the last concept that I want to talk to you about is absolute value. Now, at the beginning of the lesson, we talked about opposites. What was the opposite of negative 10? 10. What was the opposite of 8? Negative 8. Okay, so it's the same number of units away from 0, just on the other side of 0. Now, with absolute value, I'm going to see absolute value indicated by these vertical bars on either side of the number. And here's what absolute value means. Absolute value is just the number without a sign. Okay, so all I'm looking for with absolute value is how many units is it away from 0. I don't care if it's positive or negative. So the absolute value of negative 6 is just going to be 6. The absolute value of 8 is just going to be 8. The absolute value of negative 4 is just going to be 4. So it's how many units is it away from 0? I don't care if it's positive or negative. That's not what absolute value is asking. It's asking how many units is it away from 0. All right, so I want you to find the absolute value of negative 14, the absolute value of negative 20, and the absolute value of 12. And again, the bars around the number tell you that I'm looking for absolute value. All right, what's the absolute value of negative 14? 14. What's the absolute value of negative 20? 20. What's the absolute value of 12? Just 12. Just positive 12. It's not negative. That's opposite. Absolute value is the number without a sign. All right, so what if I were to ask you this? Which one is larger, okay? What is larger, the absolute value of -6 or the absolute value of 3? It is -6 because the first thing you have to do is take the absolute value. Well, what's the absolute value of -6? 6. What's the absolute value of 3?
3.
So 6 is bigger. You see, because I'm not looking at the sign with absolute value. I'm looking at the actual number. The number tells me how many units it is from 0. All right, and here's where we're going with it. Now, you're not going to see this in any of your homework assignments, but you will see it pre-algebra and algebra. I'm kind of curious who can get it right. All right, what if I had the absolute value of -12 minus 4 plus the absolute value of -5? Okay, what's it going to be?
21.
Okay, so what's the absolute value of -12? You have to take the absolute values first. Absolute value of -12 is just 12 minus 4 plus 5. So 12 minus 4 is 8, and 8 plus 5 is 13. How many people got 13? Awesome, good job. All right, like I said, you're not going to see this necessarily on a homework assignment, but you could maybe see this come up as like a bonus question or something. All right, and if you understand that, that's everything you need to know for 6.1.